All right, so we're going to get started with the second half of the course. Today we're going to be talking about externalities and taxes. And so there's going to be sort of a general theme, at least a lot of the second half of the course. So far, we've been doing this sort of standard supply and demand model. Everything just works as it does, right? We have a highly competitive market. And this just naturally sort of leads to a suggestion for unrestrained competition, right? Because the market is efficient, it produces our goods efficiently, it makes sure that we are using our resources as effectively as possible if we're talking about a competitive market. Now, this is largely true as long as the market is actually competitive, right? Which it may or may not be. We'll talk about that in a bit too. Letting the market do its thing is going to be a very effective way of getting the most out of your resources, producing the most for everyone. However, this is not always true, right? So this first for most of the second part, we're going to be covering two different things. So today, and a little bit of next week, we're going to be talking about cases in which the market is competitive and yet does not produce an efficient outcome, right? And then after that, we're going to talk about situations where the market is not competitive. And then we will branch out into some other topics entirely that don't really have much to do with market structure. Let's talk about what we're talking about today. So what we're talking about today, as I mentioned, we're looking at cases where the market is competitive. We have a competitive market that is doing its competitive market thing. We suspect that this market will operate according to supply and demand principles. That's what we're expecting. We're still with the supply and demand model. We still think that's relevant because we still have a competitive market. However, we might have some situations in which that competitive market will not produce for us an efficient outcome. Despite being competitive and the competitive market working as a competitive market does, we might not come to the conclusion that we had last time where the resources are all used perfectly efficiently. And so we're going to ask ourselves, what are those scenarios, right? Because it's important for us to know, is this a particular scenario where a competitive market is likely to give us a efficient outcome or not? Because that's going to tell you a lot about the desirability of a competitive market in different scenarios. So what I'm going to be clear about talking about here is that we are talking about efficiency still, right? We are still talking about efficiency. Does this market produce an efficient outcome? Okay. Now keep in mind, there are other things that we might care about besides efficiency, right? We might care about things like distribution. But today we're talking still about efficiency. How efficient is this market at using our resources and sending those resources to people in the form of things they like? Remember, what an efficient outcome actually is it is any outcome that maximizes the total amount of surplus in society. It's not efficient for producers. It's not efficient for consumers. We're not talking about profit. We're not talking about how good of a deal people are getting. We care about the use of resources in society as a whole. We want society's marginal benefit to equal society's marginal cost, telling us that society is maximizing its economic surplus. The total surplus is as big as possible. So that's what we're focusing on. There are other things to consider, how that surplus is distributed among individuals. We're not going to cover that today. So all of this is going to relate to, is the competitive market going to be allowed to do its thing, or should there be some sort of restriction or regulation on it? And we are going to only be focusing on regulation that will be justified for the purpose of improving efficiency. We want a resource to be used really efficiently. Yeah, maybe there are other reasons to have regulation if you don't like the efficient outcome, but at least you got to recognize that in those scenarios, you are going to be taking yourself away from efficiency, that there's going to be a cost to society of distributing things differently, unless you're in one of these scenarios. When we're talking about a competitive market. So what we are talking about here is something called market failure. Market failure is what is the name that economists have for when a market left to its own devices does not produce an efficient result. That's all that it is. Does this market, allowed to do its thing, give us an efficient use of resources? Now this could happen because the market is not competitive, right? All the nice things that we've said about competitive markets and them producing efficiency is specifically about competitive markets. And so if we are not talking about competitive markets, then yeah, that could be one way we can get away from that. But there are also other reasons. This can be a justification for regulating a market because in these cases, it may actually make the market more efficient under regulation, assuming the regulation is itself designed efficiently, which is a whole other question. So there are two main ways in which this shows up, where we have a competitive market, and yet it is not going to produce an efficient result for us. One of them is called externalities, and the other one is called rivalry and excludability. We're going to talk about both of them today. Oh no, we're going to talk about one of them today. We're going to talk about the first one today. We'll talk about the other one next week. Any questions so far? These are things that would lead to a market failure. So, externalities. This is something that I've hinted at a number of times before. So far, we've been focused on people who are in a market, right? Are you a buyer? Are you a seller? That's not the exhaustive list of all the people that there are. There are people who are not in this market, right? So we've been talking about consumers and producers. That's it. And a competitive market will give us the most efficient outcome if those are the only people that matter, right? However, sometimes they're not the only people that matter that might be relevant to that particular market. So a model that only includes consumers and producers and ignores other people who are affected by the market is going to lead to an inefficient outcome. The market by itself will not produce an efficient outcome for us. So what is an externality? An externality occurs whenever the size of the market, the amount of the good that is traded, has an effect on people outside of the direct costs and benefits that people incur by making and consuming that good. So it's external to the market, right? Someone who is not buying or selling the good is nevertheless affected by its existence. That is an externality. What does that mean? An externality is going to come up whenever a firm's production or a consumer's purchase of a good has an effect on someone other than that producer or that consumer. And this can be any kind of effect. It can be a positive effect, it can be a negative effect, but the important thing is that there is some sort of effect, that my decision affects you, even though you had no control over my decision. So externalities are a specific case of a more general economic problem, which is when the person who's making the decision is not the same as the person who's being affected by the decision. Right, so we're talking about externalities, which is the specific way that that particular problem applies in like a market setting, but you can imagine it applying in lots of other cases, right? So for example, textbooks, right? Why are textbooks so expensive? Well, one reason for that is that the person who decides what textbook you buy is the professor, and the person who pays for the textbook is you, right? So as a professor, you don't have any incentive to choose a cheaper textbook because you're not the one paying. Right? And so really, we've seen textbook prices going down a lot recently, which if you're paying for textbook and you're like, oh my God, this is expensive, that's way cheaper than it used to be. It used to be a lot more expensive. Not even that long ago, like 5 or 10 years. And that's because of administrations telling professors like, hey, you should probably pick cheaper textbooks. We're going to make you do it, making it that professor's incentive to actually, choose a cheaper textbook. So that's an example of somebody making a choice that affects somebody else, which of course is not going to be aligned with that person's interests. That same thing is going to be going on with externalities, right? We have a production and consumption of a good that affects other people. And so I'm going to make my decision of how much to produce and consume of this good based on what I think, right? And what I want. But that's not going to be aligned with what this person over here wants, right? So we're not going to be satisfying their desires and maximizing their economic value. Right? So in a competitive market, individuals worry only about themselves. They do not incorporate the externality into their behavior. Okay? And so, the professor is not choosing the cheap text, is not choosing the textbook, keeping in mind the full extent of the effect that it will have on the price that people pay. Competitive market will produce one outcome, but if society could somehow choose as a whole, they prefer a different outcome. This is almost the definition or one way of defining efficiency, right? If society as a whole could come to a decision, it can't. But if it could, it would choose a different decision than the one that the market chose, right? That's telling us that this is going to be inefficient.